Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 76. And we are living here in the far-flung year of 2020. This wonderful, futuristic year where everything is wonderful and all problems have been solved and there are robots and flying cars and this is bullshit. And video games lie to us. They've been setting games in the near future since the 80s, and now we've lapped most of them.
Yeah, it's funny looking back on dates. Like I've talked about this on other podcasts, but like the famous newspaper that they actually printed from Back to the Future, which I have from Back to the Future 2, like we passed that year, so they printed the actual facsimile newspaper that was in the movie. It's funny when we catch up to stuff like that, because everyone in the 80s thought, we'll never get to the 2000s. That's so far away.
Yeah, and where we were in the late 80s, early 90s, like the direction of things felt so different to where things were going than to where we are now.
Yeah, and I mean, so many games have predicted the future poorly. Others that we'll talk about, I'm starting to be afraid that are predicting them accurately. We're not recording this in a vacuum. We are recording this during the quarantine and the self-isolation that we are all trying to follow to bring down the cases of the virus, as it were. I don't have to worry about us being demonetized because nobody pays us anyway.
Right. Yeah. So we often don't date our episodes as far as when we record them. To be fair, we've always wanted to have a backlog, and we're actually in the middle of making one. We're recording this on March 29th, 2020. So who knows? Maybe by the time this episode comes out, we're all going to be fine. I'm a hopeful little idiot.
Yeah, I am too. We're in the same space. But I feel like in a matter of commiserating, at least, it's worth being honest about. But that said, a lot of that, what's going on now, did inspire Geoff to today's topic, which is looking at how video games have poorly predicted the future. I mean, the first game that comes to mind is actually a game that the Angry Video Game Nerd did recently, which is, I believe, called Raid 2020, which was an NES game that takes place in the year 2020, and you're like this private eye in this weird pseudo future fighting criminals. It's a very weird, I mean, it's a Nintendo game, so you have to like assimilate a lot of the actual narrative, but it was just very weird and very bizarre. Like you're fighting robots and criminal people and like drones and like, so I mean, they got some of it right. We do have drones in 2020.
Yes, we do.
But I feel like the game as a whole doesn't really, it feels very kind of Shadowrun-y, like, you know, after the fall of the civilization and rebirth of civilization kind of future, which clearly didn't happen. And I just think it's interesting when games try to predict the future and what it'll be like, much like TV and movies, and how close or not close they come to it.
It's also kind of funny to look at the different sort of futures these games would predict, and a lot of them could be classified, I think, as cyberpunk adjacent, one way or another. Whether you get like the future level in Turtles in Time 2020 Neon Knight Rider, where they were on the floating hoverboards and the glistening, glittering, glitzy cities and skyscrapers in the background. They feel very Batman Beyond in their design aesthetics, and also another NES title that's got that same kind of like, okay, I guess it was Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight.
Oh, that's right.
Which, yeah, I distinctly remember renting that game while I was staying at my grandparents' house because they had an NES, and it was like, I growing up, I skipped the Super Nintendo.
Okay.
I skipped owning it. I went back and got it. While it was a thing, my friends had it. I would play it at their house, but I just had the Nintendo, the NES. So there were a lot of franchises and games that were like, well, the only system I can get Mortal Kombat on is my Game Gear. Who's got a move list for that? No one? No one. Oh, man, Street Fighter looks cool. Oh, they made one for the Nintendo? Cool. What is this cyberpunk bull? And yeah, it was and I know some of that has to do with the localization that went on with it, but it was still just like, in the far-flung year of 2010, I think the MacGuffin phlebotinum is called cyboplasm. Like those sorts of words that were like, yeah, the futuristic Z-Rust of the 90s. Z-Rust is a term I absolutely love. If you're not familiar with it, it's the idea of the future set by that someone in the past thought of, and then you reach and you're like, there's no way we're going to get that. Like, think of the glowing rings Jetson car idea of the future from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
That's Z-Rust.
Oh, wow.
And so, I think late 80s, early 90s Z-Rust is cyberpunk one way or the other. So we get stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and even there are games that are set only a few years out from where we are, like the infamous or famous Captain Commando series, which is one of Capcom's big beat-em-up series, takes place in 2026. And, there's people in mechs and, augmented humans and super criminals. And it's hilarious to me. And this game came out, I think it first came out in the 80s, during the late 80s. No, early 90s. It was 91. It's just funny to think 30 years from now is so far in the future, even in the 90s. When we had more technology, we were still projecting to the future everything's going to be so different when we get there. We're going to advance everything beyond. We're going to have cyborgs and babies driving mechs. It's going to be crazy.
Yeah. Well, and maybe some of that has to do with the idea of video games being a younger medium at the time.
Yeah.
There's certainly, early 90s, we were getting towards, to go back to Mortal Kombat for a moment, the scrutiny of moral watchdogs about, what video games are doing to our children, either violence or just staring at the TV too long. And we're running into nowadays more the thing of we're losing games because of copyright laws and poor archiving. And some of that is, again, this who's going to care about these games in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Thinking that the games might be more, I don't know, disposable or forgettable, or that we would just move on past them, that it wasn't a big deal that we would, if this game sets the end of the world at October 31st, 1997, are you still going to be playing this NES game in 1997, in 2007, and beyond? Maybe there's a sort of short-sightedness about that, but it might be understandable.
Yeah. But
it is very funny.
It is pretty funny. Let's look at one of our favorite video game series, the Mega Man series. 20XX felt like the future because we were in the 80s and 90s of 1980 and 90, and the 2000s just seemed so far away at that time. And it's this projection of robots being given intelligence, artificial intelligence, and, we're living in harmony with them. And it seemed somewhat achievable, because if you look at the Mega Man cartoon, the world itself, while the buildings were a little different and there might have been flying cars and stuff, construction robots were still building buildings like humans build buildings. The world that these robots inhabited wasn't that different from modern day. So I'd say Mega Man actually was the closest to predicting the future, because it predicted minor changes, with the major change being sentient robots. But beyond that, especially in the cartoon, if you look at the world, it mostly felt like the modern cities of today, at that time. And I think that was intentional, right? To make it relatable, to make you feel invested.
I think so too. And Mega Man's design and sensibilities and origins lie in Astro Boy. And that's another one of those 1960s looking at into the 21st century. And again, all of these things being developed towards the end of decade, century, millennium, that whole idea of as we cross over boldly into the 2000s, the 21st century, it all feels very epic.
Yeah.
I definitely remember being like, 13 and it's like, oh man, the 2000s. Wow. And like it overwhelmed me even as a child. But I haven't watched a ton of Astro Boy, to be fair. A lot of what I know was like either clips or images and pop culture osmosis. But I think the design as well was similar to what Mega Man created, that like a slightly cleaner, maybe cleaner lines, but still very relatable modern world just with robots. And I mean, to be fair, we are living in a world where I guess Alexa would most likely become a robot master.
Probably. I mean, also, what are the names of those dogs that Boston Dynamics make that can move like animals? Have you seen those?
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, yeah. I've seen those. I don't know what they're called, but I think like I think out of all the people who've seen it, maybe 10% can name them.
Yeah, but those seem like I've watched Adam Savage interact with them, and like it moves like an animal. Like it's really weird and a little trippy. Like it hops in place when it's excited, and like I don't know if there's I'm pretty sure there's no sentience behind it, but there's definitely like a protocol and a behavioral pattern, which is really interesting to see in real life and feels very uncanny valley, but if I can get one of those to be designed to look like Rush from Mega Man, I'm sold. Like, give me one. I want it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking up Boston Dynamics right now, and they've got Spot and Handle and Pick.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, you're right. It's kind of nice to look at those and go like, okay, we're getting a little bit of the robot future, but we are definitely not necessarily getting baseball playing robots.
No, for sure not.
Which it was actually one of the big incentives, impetuses for me to think on this topic was when not too long ago it was pointed out to me. A friend of mine was like, you know what game we should get for the Super Nintendo? Super Baseball 2020. Which, for the Super Nintendo, naturally wasn't released in 2020. It was released back in 1991 for the Neo Geo before being brought over and ending up on the Super NES in like 93. But yeah, it was a baseball game where there were, I think, humans, mutants, and robots. And various teams were various mixes of them. And there was resources involved, and the rules were changed because of the things that were being brought in, which is some very like XFL level stuff, which is another fun thing with future settings in games. Not just the like, what will our world be like? What will our environment be? There have been so many video games, sports games that are set in the future where either it's a completely made up sport that's like, this is the sport of the future, or they've just changed the rules because cyberpunk.
Yeah.
Like Super Baseball or Clash Ball or Speedball outside of the US. Or Smash TV.
I was just going to ask. When does that?
Set in 1999. The most popular.
Yeah.
You know what? That predicted the reality show craze. So you know what? I'm going to give that to them.
That's true. But yeah, I was just, as you were bringing it up, I was thinking about Smash TV. I was like, that must have taken place in the future. I mean, what year does Logan's Run take place in? Do you remember?
I don't.
Because it's a similar kind of thing. But like, yeah, Smash TV, I remember playing the arcade of that and the Nintendo game so much. And I was just like, wow, this is the future where people fight to the death. And I mean, other movies have tried to predict that, like Gamer, which was that really not great Gerard Butler game where like you controlled real convicts in a video game style thing. Like, I don't know that we'll ever get there, although one never knows. But like, that's also trying to predict.
Maybe not on a widespread scale, but some rich weirdo.
Maybe. Yeah, it's always rich weirdos.
Maybe.
But like,
it often is.
It's interesting to see, like, if you look at Smash TV as a game, it came out in the 90s. It feels very 90s, even though it's meant to be the future, because I think a lot of these games are created unless you're creating a specific kind of science fiction, and even then, you tend to use what looks real. I mean, like, look at Westworld, the TV show and the books. Like, they can create robots who seem like people. Well, what do we do with them? We create the past, recreate the past, and visit the past, and take advantage of them and create the robot uprising, blah, blah, blah. Like, it's always interesting to me that the hubris of the humans creating stuff in the future is to often relive the past, or that it looks like the past. And I don't know if that's a limitation of our imagination, of what we're trying to see, or just because you want to still keep something that takes place in the finger quotes future relatable.
I think it's a mix of all of that. There is a definite, we never know what the present is until it's the past. We don't know what the prevailing style of a decade is until you're a little out of it. And you look at the styles of the now and look back and go, oh, we were doing that. That's what that was. The benefit of hindsight allows you to categorize. And, in the early 2000s, I don't think any of us, I certainly didn't have that feeling of like, well, what is the style of today? And we don't have any distinct whatever identity. Then you look back and go, oh no, we had a real distinct identity on this stuff. And, whether history and circumstances shift attitudes, and you kind of look back at something and go, oh, we can't do that now, or, oh, we do way better than that now. There's a distinct early 2000, literal year 2000, 1999, 2001, where I think there's an interesting apex of, I don't want to say future vision, but like looking to the future, what it is. Like, this was, The Matrix had come out, and so this I keep using the phrase cyberpunk because I really like it. And like the cyberpunk sensibilities of more niche media, video games, comic books, like indie cartoons had reached the mainstream. And something that I realized was I was reading about, because distractions, reading about Fight Club, the movie, not too long ago. And the fact that there are a lot of cultural artifacts within it, like using CRT monitors and VHS tapes, but also the prevailing attitudes within it of looking towards the future was built on people who grew up during the prosperity of the 90s and the idea that all of our major wars had been fought and we had no major crises to deal with or work with. And it felt like, the economy would just continue to rise and there was nothing left to do but, die out. And then basically most of the 2000s and 2010s have been not that at all.
Yeah.
So, and I think, the looking to the future is, you look at what's around you and then extrapolate it. The ostentatiousness of 90s design definitely held true in the sleeveless leather dusters and wildly spiked hair of every color look of so-called future properties. And you definitely see that. Like, Smash TV definitely has a feeling of somebody really liked RoboCop.
Yes.
And then got a little 90s with it in the designs of all of the sprites and characters. And that's also, I think, limitation of technology. Having big garish colors will make your sprites stick out. But there's no excuse for that announcer.
No, definitely not. That's definitely for sure. You brought up RoboCop. I was actually looking really quick to see if I could figure out when that takes place, when RoboCop is supposed to be. What year, and I thought it would be very easy to find, but unfortunately it's looking like it's not easy to find, and I'm sure the internet is screaming at me. But I feel like that's another movie that like Demolition Man also, especially Demolition Man, made fun of the future, right? Like, it made things,
oh goodness, did it
made things look futuristic, but like the three shells running gag and like how people don't have sex anymore and it's all digitized, and like some of it is making fun of the future that they saw us headed towards, and then some of it like was just like the Taco Bell thing. Like Taco Bell was the peak of cuisine. That seemed the funniest thing at the time. Whereas like, I mean, I don't eat a lot of Taco Bell, but I feel like they've expanded their menu and they have tried to expand and make things better than just generic fast food. But I still think it's funny when movies predict that. And it's hard not to talk about movies when talking about this topic, just because they do a lot of similar things, I feel like, that video games do when trying to decide what the future will be.
Yes.
Especially like with Demolition Man, like it knew it wasn't going to predict the future right. So let's have fun with it. Let's make Taco Bell the premier cuisine of the world. Let's make a running gag about how people go to the bathroom and never tell you how it actually works. Like,
right. I mean, that's a fun way of just looking at. We never talk about these things in movies. Oh, movies aren't reality. People just use the bathroom. Just deal with it, okay?
Yeah.
It's only important if something important happens in the bathroom for the plot.
Right, exactly.
And it's funny that like movies like that at the time I think got lambasted, got criticized for either ridiculousness or whatever, in weird ways come back around in the modern day, and you go, it's still not necessarily a great movie, but either I really enjoy it or I see these sensibilities in a whole new light, and you know what? They align way better now.
Yeah, I think nobody also goes to those older games that take place in a future beyond ours or the years we're in now and goes, this stinks because it's not an accurate representation of our modern times. Like, of all the reasons to not play Smash TV, I doubt anyone's going, well, this isn't what 1999 was like. I can't play this game. Like, I just, it's part, because you accept it as part of the fantasy. It's just amusing to look back on.
Right. That's exactly what it is. I don't think, you know what? I'm going to allow for maybe one or two people in the world to go, I can't suspend my disbelief.
Right.
But for the most part, games are a delightful escape. It's no excuse. This is just where we are. I mean, I don't love Metal Gear Solid for its accuracy to, frankly, anything.
Right.
Anything. And it's always been kind of a soft alternate time. It's the easiest way to look at things. I mean, I do remember when Metal Gear Solid first came out on the PS1, and I read through the instruction manual so many times and read the background information and watched all the briefings because, God, the amount of time you had when you were a kid.
Yeah, right.
So nice. But anyway, like, I still do this stuff. I just feel more guilty about it, I guess.
Right.
But when the game first came out, and it was just like, yeah, it came out in 1998, and it's set in 2005. Wow, cool. Then we get 2005, and none of that happened. And it's also a game with, floating psychics and nanomachines reviving people from the dead. And by the time the third Metal Gear Solid came out, and we're set in 1964 with technology that we barely had in the time that the game was released, you're just like, you know what? That is a series that did have a baby piloting a mech.
That's true. It did.
I mean, it was a child. I'm sorry.
Yes.
But one of them attempted to have his baby pilot the mech, and that was a source of conflict. So, yeah, I think, like many things for me and arguing about video games, Metal Gear Solid is an excellent example of how you hit the nail on the head. We're not getting mad at these games for being historically inaccurate. They do, however, give us great landmarks to like go, oh man, we've lapped the year on that. Where are we at now? What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And I guess we now live in an era with drones and AI, and I definitely had a moment like a week or two ago where I realized that we live in a world where a person tweeted enough to become president, essentially. Yeah. And I don't want to give Orson Scott Card that much credit.
Yeah.
Because I'm angry.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I hear you. I think that what's really interesting about trying to look at this stuff now that we're, here we are in the future, to quote a popular TV show.
Yep.
There are still dates in games that are far flung out enough that I'm not sure if we're headed in that direction. Like something I alluded to earlier, and the reason I brought up the quarantine and the current state of capitalism in the United States as well as the world is like, it wouldn't be an episode of this podcast if I didn't bring up my favorite game of all time, Chrono Trigger, and the fact that their future is in 2300, which for us is outside our lifetime. We won't live that long unless we're like floating brains in a jar. But
yeah, until we evolve beyond the need for asses, that's going to be beyond us. And also, I looked it up. Logan's Run is set in 2243, so that's another one that's like well outside of our life.
Okay, but like the thing about what scares me about Chrono Trigger's future, living in the world we live in now, and not to be extremely topical, but only a little, is that like that future is desolate. Everything's gone to waste. People are living in hovels. They barely have food. They're, and it's people, right? There's no aliens. There's, there are some robots, but like it doesn't feel overrun with robots. That there are some that you interact with, of course, especially Robo and then his family later. It's interesting to me to look at something like that now, because playing Chrono Trigger as a kid, you see that kind of desolate future and go, this is terrible. I feel awful, but that'll never happen. But now living through what we're living through now, I'm not saying that it will happen, but I am saying it is no longer outside the realm of possibility for me. Also, and I think I mentioned this on the show, I've definitely mentioned it on the Discord, I just finally played through The Last of Us, both the original game and the DLC Left Behind. And like, first of all, I started it before the stuff with COVID-19, but I've been playing it during, and let me tell you, that's a very different game considering the time we're living in now. And like, even The Last of Us seems like a game that like, because I don't know that they give a date. They might, but I know that it's more or less meant to feel like it takes place now, like a little bit ahead of now-ish, right? That like things went to shit within our recent future. And yes, mushroom zombies still feel kind of impossible, but the rest of it doesn't, right? Like a virus that spreads really quick, the government stepping in to try and take control, people rebelling against it or trying to find a cure, like all of that stuff just doesn't seem impossible anymore. And like, first of all, I'm really late to the party, but The Last of Us is a phenomenal game, which I know most of the internet knows already. But if you have not played through this game, even if you're not great at shooting games, which I am not, a lot of the exploration and the platforming takes precedence, and you can play it on easy with no penalty, as I did, and see this incredible story. But like the narrative is just phenomenal, but also terrifying because it doesn't seem unrealistic anymore. Zombie games and zombie movies that take place in the nearest future or even the present day seemed impossible. But now, considering the times we're living in, I am more inclined to believe a thing like that could happen. I still have more faith that it won't, but like it's not like early science fiction when we were younger going, that can never happen. Like I feel like we've come far enough, both with games like The Last of Us or even games like, movies like Back to the Future, like it doesn't seem super impossible. Some of it seems implausible, but it doesn't seem impossible.
Yeah. And I mean, the purpose of speculative fiction and science fiction has, since almost its inception, has been very much about criticizing or putting a microscope on the social mores and living situations and trajectory of the then modern day of whenever it's created by putting it in a fantastic realm, not in a fantasy sense, but that like a lot of classic science fiction was criticizing ideas of the day or deconstructing them or just examining them by putting them outside of the norm. And as video games have evolved and the realism that they can create, it's that whole idea of most of us have accepted that no matter how realistic a game becomes, it lives in a sort of hyper real where it has its own rules and its own ideas, and we accept that your character can fall a little further than the average person really could, or how things exist. And I think as these things all crash together, we also have a sort of future or a modern realism that is kind of a hyper now. And I think that's a good spot for games to live in. They can go, but like a good, easy, like, yes, it is like today, except this, or this is a way bigger deal than we thought it would be, or less of one. And it's interesting to look at that. And I've definitely seen, I haven't played it yet. I have, as much as I enjoy Metal Gear Solid, I haven't played through Death Stranding yet. And with quarantine, people have definitely been laughing about you thought the plot within that was so unrealistic. It's like you're playing a lone delivery man, and people are all isolated and cut off. And how's that going to happen? How's that gonna? Here we are.
Yeah.
Here, I mean, maybe not necessarily to the embryonic like packaging stuff, but you know what? I don't know everybody's Amazon history. I don't.
If you're ordering a baby in a backpack, I guess I can't judge.
It's the internet, man. You could. It's the internet. You could do so much on the internet. Can you order a baby? I don't know. You stay in long enough, you might try to find out.
Yeah, that it definitely doesn't seem. A lot of things seem less impossible considering what we're living through now. But I do take solace a lot in the games and the movies that do kind of laugh at the future a little bit or crack jokes about it. I think it's important, right? Like, one of my favorite predictions, quote unquote, of the future is something we've talked about offline quite a bit, but our favorite, I don't even remember where they're from now. I'm blanking on it and it'll kill me. But the Flight of the Conchords and their robot song about the not too distant future, like, even those kind of gags where, like, that obviously that TV show took place in modern times, and like they're wearing cardboard outfits and like heating tubes, and like it's all fantasy, but like writing a song about the future is goofy, can be goofy and silly, and that's okay. Not everything predicting the future has to be dire and dark, a la a Blade Runner. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but like Futurama, looking at the future the way it does. And now we're getting to time periods that are so far outside our frame of reference because they're just so far in the future. But like, even Futurama, like, Fry's still a delivery guy. They're still underpaid. Like, it's using the future to make fun of the present.
Right, and it's that kind of thing of, it's interesting to look at where in designs we go like, all right, what things are going to be ever present? Human nature being one of them, and what we will do with that. Yeah, I think there will always be need for delivery folk and whatnot. And the things that, like, we'll never need this, or we'll always have that. It's funny to look at how technology was speculated upon before smartphones happened, how things in the 70s, 80s, early 90s predicted personal communication would go, or the notion of flat screen monitors, seeing something set in 2053 where there's CRT big boxy TVs. I don't know of anything that's set in that exact year, but I just picked one, and I know that I'm Price is writing to that, like I'm close to something. But yeah, like, you're right, it becomes its own sort of critique and idea. And you know what? I hope there are still video games and civilization in 2038 so we can then go back and look at Detroit and go, welp. But
yeah, I think that the games that are closer to the time that we're living in now, that were made so long ago, are always going to be funny. But like, looking at a game like Cyberpunk that's coming out, that game is not that far. It's trying to, it's based on the Cyberpunk type tabletop series, which was trying to predict a future that who knows if we ever got to. But I'm curious to see how much of the video game, when it comes out, possibly later this year, because who the hell knows now, how close they model it to stuff that exists now, right? Like, the character that Keanu Reeves is playing in the game is a rock star who has a metal arm, but there are humans now who don't have appendages, who have had mechanical appendages created for them to allow them to do the things that they need to do or want to do. Like, that was something that we saw in the future that seemed impossible for someone to have a metal arm. where it's now actually quite a feasible reality that tons of folks who don't have a hand or an arm or a leg have things to help them get around and still compete in Olympics, do heavy lifting, do whatever they need those things to do or want those things to do. Because I don't want to be ableist. I don't want to say they need it, because they can exist in their space even without those things if they so choose. But if they want those things, they can get them. And that seemed like something that was impossible in games at one point.
Yeah, it's that way that fiction influences nonfiction, influences fiction. There's so many pieces of technology, not even entire systems of tech, but this little idea came from people loving Star Trek in the 60s, which is, a huge example of let's examine the ideals of today through a utopian future. And people just loving the show one way or the other and being like, man, I want those touch screens. Here we are. If not distinctly that, how many people that work for NASA now and making advances that we enjoy grew up watching Star Trek or things that were influenced by it. One of the shifting morals, I guess, of cyberpunk is nowadays there's a look at those bio-augmentation, giving yourself cyborg parts, either replacing lost limbs or upgrading yourself as losing your humanity. Whereas a lot of it in the early 90s was more of a taking ownership of oneself and not simply looking at the frame you were given and going, well, this is all I have. And to what you were talking about with what people have been able to do with limbs these days and allowing people to sort of choose the activities that they're able to do and live the life that they want to live based on not just the hand they're dealt, is the hopeful part of what are often weird cyber samurai hacktivist conglomerate corporate future stuff that cyberpunk also had. So it's, who knows what of modern life is influenced into Cyberpunk 2077 and how much we will build off of that possibly in the future in terms of our real life. That's the hopeful side of, missing the mark on speculative fiction.
For sure. I think for me, the reason I'm most curious about 2077 is just because that is a year that we can live to. We're not guaranteed to live to, but based on human lifespan, we could live to that year.
Yeah.
And it probably, based on the trajectory, won't look like whatever they come up with. And they're creating it. This is not a Nintendo game that's being created in the 80s. It's being created now in 2020 to predict 2077. And of course, the designers aren't always looking to predict, right? Sometimes they just want to have fun in the space. But that game for sure, I'm really curious about. And God bless us, if we're still podcasting in 2077, you can bet your ass we're going to do an episode about it.
Damn right.
But that said, I'm focusing on that one specifically just because it's something being made now that's not they could have easily just flubbed the date and pushed it to 2177 or 2577. The fact that it's taking place within our feasible lifetime, at least yours and mine, is fascinating to me because I'm curious. It's something we could realistically revisit if we're still podcasting then and be like, how accurate is this? What is this? What was the thought process, Yeah,
you're right. And I think after the whole 21st century bubble burst, in a sense of once we got out of the 1990s or just the distant future, the year 2000 was 20 years ago now. And for the last 20 years, it's just been here we are in the 2000s. Kind of feels like the 90s, except. Right. So I think any sort of speculative future or speculative present is a little looser, or we're a little less looking back going, oh man, they messed that up, because I think we put so much onus, we put so many expectations into what the 21st century would be. And now we're, it's been 30 years since the 90s started. But
yeah.
Just always remembering that. But so, yeah, if we get to 2077 and some things aren't quite right, and we're still even able to play the game on a system because of the way archiving goes, but it's like, whatever. It then just kind of becomes fun landmarks.
For sure. And I think that ultimately some of the future was predicted right. Like, for example, our favorite video game console is a thing that plays games on your TV and also in handheld and looks just as good in both places with no extra tech per se. It comes with everything it needs to do that. Like, it can't run stuff that are on the more powerful systems sometimes. And if it does, there's definitely a difference in quality of graphical capacity. But that said, the Nintendo Switch is not a device I ever imagined would exist when I was playing my Game Boy in the 80s and 90s. It just was so outside my frame of reference and possibility. And now I don't want to play games any other way. I mean, I've recently re-fallen in love with my PS4, but like my choice system is the Switch because of the future technology it feels like. And I think that's still pretty cool when it comes down to it, is that some of the things we have achieved as far as computers and phones and video game systems, the technology side of stuff, truly does feel like the future, even if we don't have flying cars and, hover trains and other things, hoverboards and things like that.
Honestly, that sort of technology was always kind of a bad idea, I think. It's like, why should we hover when wheels still work? What? So many people can't be trusted to drive terrestrial cars. Don't put it in the air. Don't add another axis on this.
No, yeah.
Why would you do that?
Living in New York as long as I have little faith in people to fly in cars in the air when they can barely drive them on the ground.
Yes, when you have the idea of like, well, if we put it up in the air, there'll be less traffic. No, there'll be more cars. We will always fill the space you give us. Parking will be even worse.
And you'd have to look in so many more directions than just forward, left, and right. You'd need a hole in the floor so you could see below you. Like, the logistics.
Oh, yeah. I'm not trusting cameras and AI on that.
No, definitely not. I do complain when I'm in a friend's car or a family member's car that has, like, rear cameras so you can park better. I'm like, in my day, we parked our cars using our wits and gumption. We didn't need a damn camera to tell us how to park a car.
So, silly thing about how I live my life. Living in New York City, my wife and I do have a car that lives in New Jersey at her dad's house. We use it for like road trips and things, and we're very lucky that, his driveway has space for us. This car was like Sarah's second car ever. And I think it was like a 2006, 2007 car. Mm-hmm. So it was, it has no backup camera. So anytime I'm in a car with a backup camera, I still feel like it's an ooh la la. Well, look at you with your luxury car. It's
right.
So standard feature nowadays. But
it is.
It's also a car where I don't know. I'm pretty sure I've told you this, Matt, but I just need the public record to know this. This is a car that the year it rolled out was the year they phased out the tape deck, because who uses cassette tapes anymore? But before adding an aux jack so you can plug in your iPod, phone, or whatever. So we only have a CD player. And that is another piece of technology that, while still existent, not as many people just have CDs of music. You buy it digitally or you buy it on vinyl because, again, future or past, never present. But so it is the one arena where, like, I'm living in the year 2020 and I'm still making mix CDs. So there's that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely skews my view of what is modern technology or what is passe. I definitely have every time a car has a backup camera or features that have been standard for the last 5 years. We're still, 8 years after my most recent car.
Yeah, I mean, and that said, we have the Teslas, which exist, which are future cars. I've ridden in those. They make no noise. It's very weird. As someone who's had an old car, every time he's had a car, I've never had a current car, because who has that kind of, in this economy?
Yeah, well, and especially living in a city, you're like, I'm not going to spend full price on this thing. That's insane.
But that said, like, I've ridden in Teslas. They feel like future tech, and it's bizarre, but I imagine, I don't find it that hard to believe that that's the future we're headed to. I mean, as long as the electric cars stay on the ground, I think Geoff and I are in agreement, then sure, go for it. But
I would love that. That would be so good. We keep edging towards being extremely political in this episode.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm here for the electric car.
But yeah, I think that to create some kind of summation to the last at least 10 minutes of rambling is that I think Geoff and I wanted to do this episode because it's just really fun to look at what these games that we discussed today did get right, didn't get right, and then also kind of look with minor horror in the things that aren't that impossible to imagine too, because we were always creating games. When you're creating a fantasy, if it takes place in the era of dragons and the past, that's all right, well, that exists, in a fantasy world that could never be real. But when we start creating modern setting games or games that are just outside modern setting, you begin to wonder, well, how much of this is fantasy? Could we achieve these things, Or are some of these things just the ridiculous fantasy of someone who wasn't trying to predict the future and just wanted to create a thing?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite NES game, Crystalis, is one that is actually set in the far-flung future. When I pulled the date October 31st, 1997 out of my hat earlier this episode, that is the date that the apocalypse happens or the fall of civilization occurs within this game. And then, technology was considered to be mankind's downfall. So we used the last of it to build a floating tower with all of mankind's secrets and throw it in the sky so that people without technology couldn't reach it. And then the ways of swords and sorcery were rediscovered after the Great War. I think this game is set in 2097 or the early 22nd century.
Yeah.
With swords and magic and mutants and monsters, because all of the war shifted the Earth's axis and all of this crazy stuff. So it was just another spin on things of being able to make a fantasy world. But here's why this fantasy happens. And I suppose that's my favorite wrong future. And I guess yours would be Chrono Trigger.
Probably. I mean, it's definitely harder to say that it's the wrong future as it's still so far away. But
Lavos did not destroy civilization in 1999.
Okay, fair enough. Nope, you make a good point. Can't argue there. That's true, because it does predict a shorter future to 1999 and then jumps out they talk about how they've been living for 300 years after the attack of Lavos. So you're right. It was not predicted by Squaresoft that a giant spiky creature would come out from the Earth's core and destroy the world.
Right. And I don't remember there being floating islands in 12,000 BC, but you know what? I wasn't there.
That's true. None of us were there. We can't say. We just have to assume. I mean, I don't think Chrono Trigger actually takes place on Earth, which is part of it too. But
right. But it's one of those they use. I definitely feel like they were leaning into that idea of 1999. Oh, that's not that far off. And even though, it's not set on Earth, it gives you that future feeling. It gives you that, future worry.
Yeah, I will say that I do want a giant singing cat robot to hang out at a festival that I can practice fight with. Where is that?
What? I think I imagine someone has created something like that, or enough people have created disparate elements of that, whether a singing robot, a combat robot, a cat robot, all of these, Put it all together.
There you go.
Give us gato.
Exactly. Give us gato now.
Let the gato happen.
Exactly. But that said, we, of course, as always, want to know what you think about how games predict the future. Do you have a favorite game that took place in the quote-unquote future that didn't come true or you feel could come true? We always like to hear your thoughts on this. Or just let us know we're raving madmen, which is completely possible at this point. You know, it's X amount of days in quarantine, so who the hell knows?
Yeah, it's 2020. You know, raving lunatics don't have to be just found on the street corner. They can be found in every corner of the internet.
Exactly. But of course, if you want to join in the conversation, you can do it on Twitter, on Facebook. You can go to our Discord, which there's a permanent invite link at certainpov.com. Please check out the other shows on the network too. Geoff was a recent guest as of when we're recording, but probably not as of release, on Another Pass, talking about Iron Man, a movie that takes place in the pseudo present, but has tons of future tech in it.
Yeah, another one where like it's the future. No, it's now. It's now. It's just it's the hyper now.
It's just the weird now. It's fine.
Yeah. So, but yeah, please let us know your favorites, your least favorites. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, aka Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Did you know Rob Thomas has been writing since the mid-90s?
The Matchbox 20 guy?
No, the guy behind Veronica Mars.
Oh, and iZombie.
And Cupid, Party Down, the Cupid reboot.
I haven't seen those.
Me neither, but we should watch them and then talk about them on our podcast.
Yes. We could call it the Rob Thomas.
No, not that one.
Robcast.
Every other Tuesday with Alex and MJ.
Find us at notthatrobcast.libsyn.com or wherever you download podcasts.